In a minute or so, we're going to be talking about one of my new books. And if you're just tuning in, I'm Jerry Apps, and I'm sitting in my office. So one of the things that we do in these trying times is to do things a little differently, and this is one way to do that. So I want to, in getting started, I want to invite you all to Book Bites, which is what these programs are called. And it's a series of authors from the Wisconsin Historical Society Press who share some of their information about some of their books. And so I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'm going to be talking about this book, When the White Pine Was King. And if you have questions, there should be a place on the bottom of your screen that says comments, and write down any question you might have. And there'll be some time at the end where I will answer questions if you have any. So to begin with, as we talk about when the white pine was king, we're talking about the history of the logging industry in Wisconsin, which is a fascinating part of Wisconsin's history. You might ask, how did I get interested in writing about this? Because I've written about many things concerning Wisconsin, including Wisconsin's agricultural history and information about the pioneer days and information about when I was a kid growing up on the farm. But the logging industry was a very important part of our history, and it went on for, probably, 100 years, not quite. And I want to, as I mentioned, I grew up on a farm, and we had a woods just to the north of our house, and we heated our house with wood stoves. So my introduction to logging, which is considerably different from what I'm going to be sharing in a minute, was all about cutting wood every fall and making it ready for our wood stoves. I also was a 4-H member for a number of years. And as a 4-H member, I was enrolled in the forestry project, which I was able to receive free trees, little trees, just little bitty guys. And I planted them in a transplant bed, and then when they grew to be 3 or 4 years old, I transplanted them out long next to the woods that I talked about earlier. And today, I drove by there not recently. Those trees are 100 feet tall and many inches around. Well, now to get on to talking about the history of the logging industry and when the white pine was king. When we go back to, let's see, 1836, that's the year that Wisconsin became a state. And by 1838, we have a fair amount of settlement already taking place in Wisconsin. That settlement was pretty much along the south and east of the Fox River and the Wisconsin River. That southeastern part of Wisconsin. That's where our early pioneers settled, and that's where our early farming took place. North and west of that was a vast area of, it had been the purview of the Native Americans and the French traders and all of that sort of thing for a very long time, going way back to the 1600s. And by 1838, some of the people in Wisconsin began to see, what's that all about? What's that northwestern part of Wisconsin all about, where the great white pine trees grew? And these were magnificent trees. My gosh, they would be more than 100 feet tall, and they would be 30 inches in diameter. And at that time, meaning 1840s, 50s, 60s, up to the Civil War, we saw a great expansion in this country. We saw a lot of building taking place in cities like Chicago and Milwaukee and St. Louis. And to build all of the homes and barns and all the businesses that were occurring at that time, white pine lumber was in great demand. And so we saw the beginning of the logging crews moving into the north after the Indian treaties had been solved. And these logging crews, and there at one time I think there was as many as 100 of them, working in northwestern Wisconsin. They were cutting the white pine trees in the winter, and I'm going to talk about a logging camp in just a little bit. Cutting the logs in the winter, piling them on the riverbanks, and floating them down the rivers, the Wisconsin and the Wolf and the Chippewa. Floating them down the rivers on log drives, the romantic part of the story. On the cover of my book has a picture of log drivers. And I'm going to be talking about log drivers and log driving in just a little bit. Well, let me first say a bit about how a logging camp was established, because they were quite an interesting institution, these logging camps, if we could call them institutions. First, they operated from November to April, only in the winter, because it was necessary for snow to be on the ground to do what they were doing. And of course, it was easier working in the woods in the winter. There were any bugs and mosquitoes and all that sort of thing. So the logging camps were operated from November to April. And the first thing that happened in the establishment of a logging camp was a timber cruiser. This was a fellow who was adept at figuring out the economic value of a given acreage of timber. And he would go into an area and he would determine how many white pine there may have been that existed on an acre. And he carried that information back to his boss, who headed up the logging company. And by the way, in the early days, and I'm talking about 1850s, 60s along, and there, many of the logging camps had difficulty finding help. Because Wisconsin's pioneers, the farmers, they didn't know anything about logging camps. They knew about how cutting down oak trees and clearing land for farming. But they didn't know anything about cutting down huge pine trees so that they could go to the sawmills and be sawed into lumber. So where did they get the logging crew members? Well, they came from the east, from Maine, from New Hampshire, Vermont, eastern Canada, people who at the time, men who at the time had experience with logging and had been doing it there. And the logging companies invited them, paid them fairly well, to come and work for them. Okay, now we've got the timber cruiser has decided that this area is worthy of cutting the timber. And the logging company agreed, and the first group of men to come into the area, relatively small crew, maybe half a dozen men or more, what they did was they cut down enough trees to build a bunkhouse, to build a mess hall, to build a kind of a barn housing for the oxen early on and horses later. And when these buildings were established, a bit later, the entire crew arrived. And in a crew for a typical logging camp was about 25 lumberjacks, as they were called. And they received pay about $30 a month, $1 a day. And of course, they had a bunkhouse to sleep in and a mess hall to get their meals. And to tell you the truth, they didn't have any place to spend their money because most of these logging camps were quite isolated. The camp cook was also a terribly important figure in the logging camp, because the camp cook was responsible for preparing 3 meals a day in the most primitive of conditions, with wood stoves and lamps and lanterns for light. And yet, and most of them were men, he was responsible for keeping these men happy, because an unhappy man, because the meals weren't good, was not a good lumberjack. So what was it like then to be a lumberjack in a lumber camp? And some of the guys were young. They were 16, 17 years old. By the time they got into the middle 30s, that was sort of the outside limit. So very young to maybe 30s. Now I'm going to talk about what was involved. What did they do? What did the lumberjack do in a typical day? Now they would go into this area that had been cruised by the lumber cruiser, and the first thing they would do they would make out a little logging road, cut out a road that would allow them to haul their logs that they cut from the logging camp area to the banks of a river. Because one of the things that the cruiser looked for, which I should have mentioned, was access to a river so that they could transport their logs down the river. So the first thing a lumberjack would do, and they had axes and cross-cut saws, no fancy mechanical gasoline-operated chainsaws, none of that. A two-person chainsaw, one man on each end, and an axe. And one of the lumberjacks would notch the tree, which meant literally cutting a notch in the tree with the axe on the side of the tree toward which they wanted the log to fall. And then on the other side of the tree, with a cross-cut saw, one man on each handle, back and forth, back and forth. And I spent a lot of time on the end of a cross-cut saw when I was a kid, so I know what that was like. Always pulling, never pushing. And then when the tree was ready to fall, that well-known call that you associate with timbering, the words timber, and the tree would fall crashing to the ground. Can you imagine a 100-foot pine tree, 30 inches and more in diameter, crashing to the ground with a thunderous roar? And then the lumberjacks would cut off all of the side limbs and cut the tree into logs 60 feet long or so. And then they would, with a team of horses and something called a go-devil, which was a kind of a little sleigh that would lift the front end of the log off the ground so it wouldn't drag in the snow. And they would hitch the team to this go-devil with a log on it and pull the log to this road that I mentioned earlier, where there was a sleigh, a huge sleigh, a place where they loaded these logs 15 feet high on these giant sleighs pulled by 2, 4, 6 horses. And toward the river they would go then and unload those logs on the river bank. And in the spring of the year, April generally, when the ice went out, these logs were rolled into the river. And the logs downstream, one after the other, with these men riding on the logs, riding the logs to the sawmills down the raging river, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. I'll come back to some of that later. I want to talk a little bit about what life in the logging camp was like. Can you imagine now, here we've got 25 men all living together in this mess hall with no lights, stove heating the thing. And in the daytime when they're out working, by and large, they would come in, their socks, woolen socks, were wet. They would hang their socks up all around the stove. And so you could you imagine walking into this building with all of these men and the smells that you would confront. Anyone who has smelled a wet sheep or a wet piece of wool knows that it's not a pleasant smell. Mix that with the smell of oak smoke, and that's the kind of smell that you would run into as you came into the logging camp where all of the men were sleeping. And on Sunday, they worked 6 days a week. On Sunday, they did not work, but what they did, many of them would wash their clothes. And they never took a bath, by the way, all winter long. No, too much bathing would weaken you. My dad even used to say that. Too much bathing would weaken you. So they wouldn't take a bath. But they would take their clothes and they would put them in a metal cauldron sort of a thing, build a fire under it, and they would boil their clothes to kill the bed bugs, among other things. And sometimes in the camp there was a fiddler, and he would play the fiddle, and then they would sing, and then and sometimes on Sundays they could have one of the guys was adept at shaving them, and so they would be shaved, and then they would tell these wonderful stories, Paul Bunyan stories. Paul Bunyan, Minnesota, Upper Minnesota, Wisconsin, Upper Michigan. Paul Bunyan stories, extravagant stories, stories that were not anywhere near the truth, but wonderful stories that entertained these lumberjacks isolated out there in the woods in the dead of winter when it's 20 below zero and 30 below zero. And then there were stories of the hodag, which came out of the Rhinelander area. And this was a ferocious animal that was supposedly alive and living in the Northwoods. And when a new lumberjack had come along, maybe he's 17, 18 years old, in the dead of night, they would say, "Now listen." And they would hear this ferocious scream of the lumberjack. And the lumberjack, the hodag, of course, was one of the lumberjacks that had gone out there, and he was doing the crazy howling. But they had him believing that such a thing was alive. And even one time, Gene Shepard was the chap from Rhinelander who came up with this thing. They they even had him exhibit the hodag at the county fair, at the Oneida County Fair. And one of Gene Shepard's kids, in a dimly lit tent, so you really couldn't see what was going on, he provided the ferocious howl of this machine. Well, now let's come back to this pile of lumber that's dumped into the river. Floating down the Wisconsin, floating down the Chippewa, floating down the Wolf River, floating to the sawmills. Each river had its own characteristics. The Wisconsin River had lots of twists and turns and little waterfalls and rapids, and so it was a difficult river for doing a river drive. And so many sawmills grew up along the Wisconsin River, more than most any other place, because it was so difficult to move the logs down the river. And can you imagine now? And I'm back to this picture on the cover. Riding, they have a long pole, pike pole it's called, and caulked boots, and they're literally riding these logs down the river to the Mississippi, or down to a place where they were all bound together into rafts. So there were logging rafts going down the river. And the river drive had the drivers on the logs, and then following them were another group of men in little canoe-like things called bateaus, and they looked for the logs that were tangled up on shore, caught in the rocks or something like that, and they would get them going down the river. And and following all of this was another a raft with a little building on it called a wanigan. And in this wanigan was the cook who cooked the meals for them when they were going down the river. And it was also a place where they kept their personal things, their clothing, and each of them had a tent. And so at day's end, they built a dam to hold the logs in place, and they set up their camp on shore, slept in a tent, had their meals made by the cook. And occasionally, I have a picture in the book of women were working as cooks in some of these things. So that whole era of logging took place from about the 1850s way up into the 1870s and 1880s. And then something happened that changed everything. The railroads came in. And by 1910, early in the century, there were no more log drives, no more log drivers, no more log jams, which I failed to mention. Log jams where the logs got tangled up, piled up 15 feet high, half a mile long, logs not moving, logs stuck, and somebody had to make it work them loose, and there was generally a few men, who were skilled at breaking up a log jam. And they would go in there often with dynamite and blow up what was known as the key log, if I could find it, so that the logs could move again. There were many casualties, both in the log jams and in log driving in generally. And if you saw on the river bends often up on the hill, there were crosses where log drivers had met their fate and were buried there on the spot. That took place all too often. Okay, a bit more about what the benefits and the good and the bad, let's put it that way, of the logging industry. Well, the good of it, they created many jobs all across the north, all these logging camps, all these lumberjacks. Some of the farmers now in the southern part of Wisconsin, they would spend their winters working in the north. That was true of my uncle Fred. And my grandfather was a cook in a logging camp. So many jobs. They also created many of our cities and towns in the north: Marinette, Oconto, Park Falls, Peshtigo, Menominee, Rhinelander, Tomahawk, Phillips, Eau Claire, Mellon, Wausau, Stevens Point, Wisconsin Rapids, La Crosse, Menasha, Oshkosh, Fond du Lac, Black River Falls, Rice Lake, Woodruff, Sister Bay, and a lot more. They also, the logging industry, created the wood products industry that we have today. It's a major economic engine in Wisconsin, the creation of all kinds of wood products. Now, and of course the paper industry, that Wisconsin is still number one in production of paper, was an outgrowth of the logging industry. Now the bad, and there were some terrible things that resulted. The environmental damage when you clear cut acres of land was tremendous. They left behind nothing, stumps. And the University of Wisconsin College of Agriculture encouraged farmers to go into this area that's called a cutover, to remove the stumps and grow crops. Some places it worked, many places it didn't. Because the further north you go, anybody knows anything about growing things, the further north you go in Wisconsin, the shorter the growing season. And so certain crops just won't grow in the far north of Wisconsin. And so a lot of, especially during the 1930s and the Great Depression, many of these farmers failed to pay their taxes and they left. And so a lot of this tax delinquent land was left behind. And it became a lot of this former farming property way up north, became state and national forests. And when the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, came into being in 1933, I wrote a book about that too, by the way. You can read about the CCC. They came into this cutover area. There are a lot of other places in Wisconsin too, but they planted literally thousands of trees to rejuvenate the north. And so now our Northland, our Northwoods as it's sometimes referred to, is a vast recreation area, a place where tourists come from miles all around. It's a wonderful area. So as we look back at the forest industry as it was then, the history of it, we see a few companies that were doing what today would be called sustainable forestry, which is what I must do on the tree farm that I own. But not very many of them did that. They had what was known as cut and run. Cut the trees, go off to some other place. Go west, go to Washington State or Oregon, where there was still lumber trees to be cut. So the pluses and the minuses sort of balance each other. Many of the cities and towns and the industry that we have today is a result of that logging era. And we've tried to at least to correct a lot of the environmental problems that occurred. So with that, I think I'll stop. And if any of you have any questions, just write to the little place where it says comments, and I'll look and see what some of you are saying. And if you have a question, I'll be glad to try and answer it. Let's see. People are saying, thank you for this talk. Good to see me. Anybody have a question or a comment that you would type? So it's a little clumsy to see. Oh, here I've got a get myself down here. Here we go. Anybody have a comment? If not, I would suggest I'm probably the worst market person in the world, but I'm going to try. You'll want to go out and buy a copy of this and learn all about so much that I didn't share, like pictures of lumberjacks and horses and great loads of timber. Stories about what did they have to eat. I have the menus in here. I found the menus that they use. They eat pretty well. So I think with that, I'm going to stop and thank you all for tuning in. And it's called Book Bites, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I have other things coming along. If you want to learn more about what I do, go to my website, which is simply jerryapps.com. JerryApps, all one word, .com. And that's my website. I have a blog. If you want to sign up for my blog, you can go to my website and do that. My email address is there. You can write to me if you have something that you want to share. And with that, I'm going to say stay well, keep reading, and thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again next time. Good night.